Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the second part of our program where we will have the signing of the detailed documents in relation to the agreement between Charles Sturt University and Affinity, and also the launch of the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy of Australia, ISRA. I'd like to say a few words before we continue on the situation of interreligious or interfaith dialogue. There are three types of interreligious dialogue which are going on internationally at the present time in broad terms. One might be described as educational, that is, dialogue and education, including research, which tries to locate interfaith dialogue within broader religious and cultural understandings. The second is much more detailed interfaith dialogue, where there are particular academic and social problems and issues. And these we find, for example, in certain countries in Southeast Asia. For example, the dialogue and discussions taking place between Buddhism and Islam in the southern part of Thailand and the northern part of Malaysia. And then the third are those where there are serious conflicts, where there are serious issues, where both political and religious aspects of interfaith dialogue take part. And I myself was involved in one of those at the end of the last century and the first few years of this century in eastern Indonesia. Nevertheless, there seem to be four main principles which are important in all of these types of interreligious dialogue. The first is the difficult but central concern to try to be fair in expressing one's understanding of the other. Often the description of the other partner in interreligious dialogue, that description is not a description at all, but purely the first argument in defense of one's own position. It is not a description at all. It is, in fact, very difficult to be able to describe the other in broad and sympathetic terms, that is, in terms which genuinely seek to understand. And therefore, the descriptive nature of interfaith dialogue should not be assumed to be something simplistic. It is the most difficult of all. The second is the ability to engage with the major theological aspects of interfaith dialogue, rather than to ignore them and to try to relativize everything to one's own political view of the world. This temptation is very high indeed. The third is the matter of how one engages in a discussion of celebrating or appreciating the other, while absolutely respecting the integrity and the internal cohesion of the other, and one's own religious integrity and cohesion. And the fourth, of course, is the understanding of how interfaith dialogue takes place within a current contemporary liberal democracy, where all opinions can be expressed and all must be judged in the marketplace of ideas. Too often in the past, in a long tradition of academic life, it has been assumed that those who have no faith, those who stand outside the problem, are the only ones entitled to have opinions. that those outside the system are the only ones who are likely to give any interpretation which has any reliability at all. That, in the last 20 years, has been discredited in most liberal democracies. Discredited because, of course, the assumptions of those people who make judgments from outside are that what they are looking at is something which needs to be managed for the good of those involved, because they themselves are incapable of managing themselves. In other words, in rather crass terms, religion is looked upon in the same way as one might look on prostitution. That is a rather unfortunate aspect of human behavior, which a variety of pundits who have nothing to do with it will give advice on how it can be managed. Thus, religion is seen in the same kind of light, a strange aberration of humankind which others will organize. That perspective has gone, although in the political sphere, in many parts of the world, it still continues. What we, in this agreement, are trying to do is to understand that those involved in religious activity and in religious faith are those who should deal with it, are those who should engage in interreligious dialogue. And this is threatening for religious people because it demands of them the ability to describe the other without using it purely as a system for apologetics on one's own behalf. It also demands a degree of self-critical assessment of how one's own religious beliefs have in fact been carried out. And that often is not an easy thing to look at. It's important that this is carried out in a university, that is, in a community of people who are engaged in all kinds of activity. Because the issue of interreligious dialogue is no longer an issue for religious practitioners. It's an issue for social workers, for doctors, for nurses, for police officers, for those engaged in all kinds of security activities, for those engaged in agricultural life, and indeed increasingly for those who have responsibility for the built environment. For all these groups, the same demands of interreligious dialogue are there. And we, in our time, will see whether the other professions, other than theologians, are able to carry out this interreligious activity with the integrity rightly now demanded of theologians. And that's the kind of area in which we are called to engage. It is something that is new, something that is, of course, problematic, but something that needs to be carried out and will be carried out, especially by those who are aware of the pitfalls but are determined to overcome them. And so it gives me great pleasure now to invite Mr. Mehmet Ozalp, the Executive Officer of Affinity and the new Executive Director of the Islamic Sciences and Research Academy of Australia, to address us on the prospects which he sees from our cooperation. Yeah.